everybody, my name is Cherry Cheeks and today we are talking about red legs. Often when we start burlesque, it is easy to think about the idea that this community or this industry is full of individuals who are producers, who are also performers, so that means they must know what they're doing. Every single show is amazing. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. To help out some new performers, these are my personal red and yellow flags, and sometimes it's really tricky and hard to know, is it a red flag? Is it yellow? Is it somebody learning? Often there's a lot of times when I find new producers make some of these mistakes or don't even know, and some of the later pieces are going to be more extreme. Those are definitely the ones we want to avoid, hopefully with some of those flags before they get too extreme. And personally, one of the things I consider when I'm looking at producers that I haven't worked with before, or considering, is this a red flag? If it's a pattern, and if I recognize it and see that it's happened to more performers than just myself, maybe I've performed with them a few times and it keeps happening after I've talked to them. If it's a pattern and if it's something that is affecting multiple people, that's when I start to personally consider it a yellow or maybe a red flag. So first of all, I'm going to start with the yellow flags and what I consider more nuanced approaches. I don't like to make a blanket statement with all of these because it does depend on the situation. Are they maybe just different ways of existing that don't really meld well with how I like to exist? And then in that case, it might be something I have to get over. So the first one I have is communication. Is there minimal or zero communication from the producer? Some people, again, are not the best communicators. It is not a strength. It is a skill. I also don't need to be communicated with every single day. As long as I have the information I need when I need it, that is what matters to me personally. Does the producer actually follow up? There is times when there's deadlines. Some producers don't give due dates. If I were to produce a show and say, get me your show notes as soon as possible, to me that could mean by next weekend. To some people it could be the week before the show, because people's brains work differently, and some people even with reminders, they forget. But if there's ever a time when they don't follow up and then they complain on the internet, or they complain to the performers about those show notes being late after the fact, or they don't do their job as a producer to follow up and they put all the blame on the performers, with their communication again being minimal or zero, do they not include any form of accessibility information or payment info or the show date or the show venue? For some people, I've seen them actually say after the show that they figured out they were not getting paid for that. Make sure in the very beginning you do know exactly what you're getting, and if you need accessibility accommodations, if you ask them questions about what accessibility looks like, are they willing to actually give you that information, or are they trying to kind of say, oh, we focus on accessibility, but then they don't tell you what the venue looks like or what the practices are behind the scenes? And if there's ever a time I feel a producer is not being transparent about those things, then that to me is a yellow flag. Everyone has their own way of casting. One thing I personally look for with casts is, does the producer only work with new performers? It's not the same as a student showcase. It's not the same as teachers showcasing their students. It's not the same as shows that are intended for new performers and new works. Those are great. If you're a producer and you make those, please keep making those. If you're a new performer, take advantage of those. They are great to learn from and get your name out there and start to experiment. However, if there is a producer who's known in the community, who very, very rarely works with experienced performers, or who very rarely works with some of the people who are well known in your city, sometimes there's a reason for that. There's oftentimes some of the more experienced performers may not work with a specific producer, and so they end up working with only new performers. Again, that's kind of a yellow flag because you don't necessarily know the situation unless you talk to other performers in your city. And if that's the case, if you feel like you're hired for a show like that and you're unsure, I would definitely recommend you talk to your local performers and some of those more experienced performers to see if they have an experience with that producer, if they have any ideas of what behind the scenes have looked like with them. Kind of check your own boxes to see, is this something you're willing to work with and get the stage time for and the experience for and take a chance, or is this something that you feel is too uncomfortable and they might be taking advantage of new performers because they don't know the reputation. What are producers like with their beliefs? I'm a very strong believer in values and making sure that if you produce, if you perform, really knowing what your values are as a performer or as a producer. How are you going to align with those? When it comes to values and beliefs, one of the things that I personally struggle with is when a producer's beliefs actively go against human rights. And sometimes it doesn't seem as extreme as like overt open racism. Sometimes it's something as simple as saying burlesque is classy stripping. If they are actively supporting politicians who I do not support, and not just someone who I don't support, but someone who I find is actively dangerous, huge red flag. That is no longer a yellow flag for me. That is a red flag. This one's interesting. I personally don't like to work with producers who debuted a month ago. And I know that can be like a double-edged sword sometimes. It's super easy for some people to get super excited, super enthusiastic to perform, maybe to stage kitten, then you perform, and then you teach, and then you produce. Burlesque is not necessarily this pipeline of what you have to do of starting XYZ and going down the list to make sure you get to producing. Not all performers have to produce. I understand the enthusiasm and the excitement. I really encourage people to ask yourself, why do you want to produce, and what values do you want to produce, and what do you want to bring that's different than what already exists in your city or town. It's so important that people first have that foundation before you even start of why do you want to produce, what are your values, what does safety look like for you, what does inclusion look like for you, what does accessibility look like, and not just what it looks like, but how are you going to actually achieve it? How are you going to actually pay your performers and afford to produce? Sometimes people want to produce only because they don't get stage time, so they're going to make a show that they can perform in. That's a pretty common reason why a lot of people do choose to produce, and I think it is awesome and magical when it does work out, but also being mindful that it's not just because you're not getting stage time, but it's because you find there's other people in your community who are not getting stage time who you want to uplift. Is it a community-minded reason why you want to produce, or is it all for yourself? This is another thing with brand new producers. So again, yellow flag, but always an opportunity to learn and grow from here. When I see a new producer who does leap into producing without that foundation, without understanding the local history or burlesque history in general, or what shows exist, or even who performs already. And if they are called in for anything ever about like, either maybe it's the lack of diversity in their casting, maybe it's how they're promoting people, maybe it's something about their show that they're not too sure about yet. And I see a lot of new producers who say the reason of, I'm still new, I didn't know, or can you please take it easy on me, I'm new, I didn't know. I do believe that people should give people the benefit of the doubt and give people a chance, because again, we don't know what we don't know. Although I do understand it can be frustrating if someone doesn't do their homework, or if someone doesn't take the steps that they should to ensure they are taking all those preventative measures before something happens. Sometimes I think people do actually need to learn from experience. Even being called in, I think that is an experience that some people don't expect that you do learn from. And so even if somebody's brand new to producing, if they haven't learned something yet, if they're figuring things out still, that can be a reason, but it's not an excuse to over succeed that experience of the people who are calling you in. So if someone is not willing to apologize or acknowledge that they messed up, and they only care about their own feelings and how they feel uncomfortable for being called in, sometimes people can get pretty extreme, I will say that. But if they continue to keep doing those patterns after they've been called in, if they keep using being new as a reason or an excuse for some of the mistakes they're making, again, rather than talking to other producers in the city or talking to other performers to make sure they are fixing those errors, that is something that I personally hesitate around. Do they put emotional labor on the performers? I am a very strong believer in having conversations, and especially genuine like one-on-one conversations and getting to know each other. It's good. I like talking about life, but sometimes there are producers who will talk to specific performers about very specific pieces for more information that they can Google themselves. Sometimes I'm at a show, watching a show, or I'm backstage getting ready for a show, and people ask, oh, I have a show coming up next month, can you please help me with some stuff? Or hey, I have a question about how can I get more diversity because my applications didn't get that much diversity. That's usually my time off. If I have a show, I want to focus on that show, even if I'm not busy, if I'm just casually especially at home. If I don't have a relationship with somebody already, it can be draining, and some of the questions are even questions that you can even Google yourself. Honestly, if people are asking those questions, I think that is a sign and a step to continuing that education. But I think the first step is you could probably Google it before if you're going to talk to other people in your community to get more answers and learn some more nuances. Make sure you're actually paying them for that time because you are asking them for actual information. Slightly different note, is the producer not good with handling conflict? Conflict, I've mentioned a couple of pieces already about it, but one of the big things is a lot of producers have codes of conduct, or if they don't, they should. So there's another red flag if they don't have any code of conduct. But do they actually follow that code of conduct? I've seen a lot of shows where there might be people heckling, there might be people who are too drunk in the audience, maybe touching performers if they come into the audience. Do they actually get removed from the venue? I've seen a lot of times where producers are great, they will talk to these people, and if they continue that behavior after being talked to, then they will be removed. I've also seen a lot of producers who just kind of let things slide and continue to let things slide. Behavior doesn't change and things continue to happen. So to me, if a producer is not willing to actually address conflict, whether that is with their audience, people backstage, if it's them being called in for something and they're not good at handling it or not even willing to address it, to me that is a major red flag. And this is my last one of this section of the nuanced kind of yellow flags. Some of those were red flags, but it's up to you what you consider a red flag or a yellow flag. Does the producer not show respect to the performers or other performers in the community or producers? That can look like a whole lot of different things. One of the most simple ways for me personally, do they get people's names right? I've had people who've emailed me who don't know my production name, but I've seen other performers who will get emails from producers who are completely wrong name, completely wrong person. I've seen producers who mistake performers for other performers. Sometimes people are not good with spelling. I totally understand, but please double check your emails. I think the bare minimum that you can do is put in that extra time to make sure you do give somebody the right name, or you do direct your emails to the right company or the right people when you're wanting to reach out. So those are some of the more common yellow flags, maybe red flags, depending on your perspective. Moving into some of the more, these are my red flags. I will not wait for these. I will move on or avoid them. First of all is if the producer does not pay a performer rate, or if they do, it's not a good one. They might pay $20, they might pay bar split, door split. That is not an industry standard. Many of us are advocating for standards around $100 per act, but it does look different again in every city. If a producer is not paying at all or they're doing tips only, that is a red flag for me, as well as if they have shows that are based on exposure, that does not pay the bills. Exposure is dangerous. Exposure is a false narrative. I do not believe in exposure for pay. That is one of my hard red lines that I will not cross. The one exception for free is if it's a fundraiser that really aligns with my values and it's something I really want to support, but otherwise I make sure I get my pay and my guaranteed rate. I do have sliding scales sometimes, but generally I try to stick to my pay scale. And here's another one is pay to play. Pay to play, for anybody who hasn't heard of it before, is if you have to pay a fee to be in a show, or if you have to be responsible for selling a certain number of tickets to be in that show. So there's a couple of nuances. It's pretty standard for burlesque festivals to have an application fee. If you have a community show, however, those ones you should never have to pay to perform in. Tons of nuances. Those festivals, sometimes the student showcases, that's different. And similar, there are some producers or productions that do require you to actually sell a certain number of tickets, and if you don't sell those tickets, then either they're going to take it away from your pay or you have to pay them. You ever work with a producer who says you have to sell a certain number of tickets? Run. This one is kind of a yellow flag again, is do they advertise themselves as the first or the only, specifically if other people are known to have those same themes, ideas, moments in time that happened before them. I talked a little bit about being the only or the first in my tagline video, which you can watch and learn more about if you want to make your own taglines. But if you are going to be the only or the first of something as a production, you have to do your research, not just done your research for what's going on right now when you're producing, but decades, to make sure you don't see anything similar, talk to other people in your city, read a book if you have a book or books that talk about your local history. That is something I recommend you check out. And if they're called in about anything, does the producer double down or refuse to acknowledge that harm's been done? It can be very difficult because sometimes there are misunderstandings or miscommunications or, again, different perspectives. But when I see more than one person reaching out to a producer and saying, you have to change your accessibility practices, or you have to hire more diverse performers. And if the producer is doubling down saying that diversity does not equal talent, and if they're just making excuse after excuse after excuse, that's a red flag. Are their casts all white, all thin, or all cisgender women, or people who are able-bodied? Personally, I don't work with producers who have a lack of diversity in their shows. Sometimes it can be hard if you live in a city where you feel like every producer is like that, or every show has a lack of diversity. That's why I started producing Shade, is because I was tired of hearing people say that people of color don't exist in our town, even though they did. And sometimes that lack of diversity is because people see the lack of diversity and then they decide not to perform because they don't want to be part of a show or be the token performer. There's often more going on behind the scenes if there's a lack of diversity. There's a lot that we often don't see behind the scenes, and your casting choices are one of the most visible forms of that. False advertising. Does the producer falsely advertise their show? This doesn't happen very often, however, it does happen. There is a specific burlesque production that is known across North America, and when they first started, they actually were advertising many shows across North America in cities, in venues that didn't actually have those spaces booked. They were advertising performers in those shows who've never performed with them or not hired to perform with them. If there's any form of false advertising, that is one of the biggest, most obvious forms of red flags to me. Going back to kind of the pay and play idea, I know some producers who also teach, and I've seen some of those individuals say in order to be in those shows, you have to take their classes. That's different from, again, a student showcase, like taking the class and then you debut at the showcase. That's one format that is pretty common. But I've seen some producers who have just regular shows, and the producer has said that people who apply to the show actually have to take their classes first. Again, that's another form of pay to play. So I really recommend that if someone's saying you have to do something through them or you have to be mentored by them in order to be in their show, maybe not the best practice that you might want to avoid. Does the producer have a negative reputation in your city or in the burlesque community, even outside of your city? Most performers are pretty open and acknowledging of whether they've had a good or negative experience with a producer. If you have questions, if you ask around with how people felt, and if people are openly telling you they had a bad time, that usually says a lot. As well, do they put appropriative acts on stage? Do they allow white performers with locks to perform? Do they allow people in fat suits to perform? People using mobility aids who don't need them in their regular day-to-day life? There is many forms of appropriation, whether that is cultural or otherwise. I've seen even beyond what they present, but do their music choices reflect that? Are they using songs that are specifically about, say, Black liberation, but they're not a Black performer? Or are they using songs that have racial slurs in them? Or do they highlight and exoticize Orientalism or Asian aesthetics? We do still see it common enough where it is in this video. Hi, quickly jumping on here, editing Cherry. I feel like I missed some points that I think are really important to know, especially if you come across these experiences and if you're a newer performer. You get me out of makeup, burlesque Cherry, but filling in the gaps with where I forgot before. Does the producer ever get drunk or overly high or on any kind of substances during the shows that they're responsible for? Safety is our number one responsibility as producers. Putting on a great entertaining show, inspiring audiences, that is a huge part of it, but for me, the safety should always come first. Sobriety is becoming a very large conversation. We have a massive sober community who performs or attends shows or goes to events. There is a really big call for just more sober events in general. Even if it's not a sober event, having the producer be able to be cognizant, able to think clearly when they need to without delay, it's really important. I've been in shows where the producers have gotten drunk before. I've had shows where boundaries were crossed, consent was broken. I've had my hair touched backstage when I was literally waiting as the MC was introducing me to go on stage, and I was performing one of my most political acts, which is really tied to my indigeneity as a Tahltan person, pollution and the treatment of indigenous peoples across North America. For that act, often I have it in braids. And there was a producer who got drunk. They pulled on both of my braids and they neighed me like a horse. They said, "This is so cute." Literally, this is within a minute of me stepping on stage. I just think if you're producing a show, please stay sober. Some people can manage one drink. I wouldn't go beyond that personally, but I think being there for your performers, being available if people need you, even just having one drink, sometimes that can trigger other people again who might be sober. So for me, if I see producers drink at their own shows they're responsible for, I tend to stay away from those. And on that point as well, do they respect consent or boundaries? I've worked with producers before who have had zero consent and boundaries. Remember that we are professionals at the end of the day, whether or not the cast is made up with your friends or people you've hired for just that show. This is business and you do have to respect your cast. And so making sure that you know if you feel like any of your boundaries are being crossed or if you feel like there's a lack of consent, take what you want with that. Only you know where your boundaries are and only you will know what is too much for you. And if a producer is called in or called out, do they answer directly your questions, which I've already talked about before, but do they tend to circle around an issue? If a producer says something, well, that's just the business, or well, that's just art. I've seen a lot of producers and venue owners even who have refused to restrict people and their art because they see that as gatekeeping, but they have said those responses after somebody used a racial slur in their venue on their stage. Or maybe they've been called in about a lack of diversity or tokenizing performers of color or from anybody from any kind of marginalized identity, and instead they decided to use equity-based language as an excuse to say that equity exists beyond people of color. Stuff like that, or even if someone says, well, yeah, I'll take your feedback into consideration, that's similar to doubling down, and I feel like I've done my job, I've called them in, and so now they can do what they want with that information. But I will not be working with them again in that case if those are the responses. And similarly, I've also seen producers who have said they've been open to feedback and they'll have either community forums or people can message them in the DMs. Again, I've seen people say that after they've been called out and people have said that they don't feel safe or they don't feel comfortable or like their feedback will be taken seriously, so they don't message those people anyways. And because they don't get messaged, they feel like there's no issues because nobody brought it up with them. And that is a pattern I've seen multiple times with multiple producers across North America. Take with that what you want and use that to help inform your decision future if you want to work with them again. Here's another big one, and this one I find a little bit more difficult to acknowledge. Does the producer gatekeep? Gatekeeping can look like a lot of different things. The word itself can be overused incorrectly at times, but when I say gatekeeping, I mean very specifically, do they ever tell performers things like, you're never gonna get far in burlesque because of how you look, how you perform, how you interact backstage, because of your ability, how they present, how they live, what styles they lean into. If the producer ever makes you feel like specifically your art or your way of living or identity is invalid and they're telling you things like, you're not gonna make it because of this, that to me is so harmful, and it can really affect a person's mental health, how they view themselves as a performer, how they view their art, their performances, and it can really burn out their passion. And I do know performers who have really jumped into that kind of feedback they've received before to say, you know what, I'm gonna prove you wrong. And I'm so thankful for those performers who keep going. But the reality is not everyone does, because of comments and statements like that. They say, well, if you want to get far, you gotta do X, Y, Z. And if they say you have to follow a very specific way of being in the burlesque community or industry, or if you want to get anywhere, you have to do this, just know everyone's path is different, and that is okay, and you can find your way of being in the burlesque community adding your voice and your art, showcasing what makes you unique. Burlesque is full of so many diverse personalities, so many diverse styles, lived experiences, that the representation exists. We just need people to open up and be ready for embracing it and for fueling that change and following that lead so that all of the burlesque industry can catch up, but not everyone does. Does the producer hire known problematic performers? I like to believe more times than not, if someone hires someone with a history, that's not intentional or they didn't know about it. But there are times when I've seen it, when people will hire known abusers in the community or known people who have criticized trans performers in the community that have really shown their personal beliefs and views that are very racist. If a producer hires them, that's one thing. The other thing is, I've seen producers who've done that, who have been either called in or called out for hiring a certain performer, and they've, again, doubled down and they've said, well, there's two sides to one story. Well, you don't know them like I know them, or there's always going to be drama. Or like I said before, when people say things like, I refuse to gatekeep art and what art is on my stage. That doesn't justify you hiring this person who people know has caused harm. Or I've also seen comments of, well, people are too sensitive about this issue. But if there's people who have been very vocally deplatformed in the general industry or in one country or one city or whatever, I tend to lean into what people say about when it comes to that kind of stuff. There are always going to be people who want to listen to other sides of the story or who want to get the full context. Some people I am just tired of seeing hired and headlining when they really shouldn't be. If I've seen any producers either hiring or defending a person that is known to have been abusive or coercive or assaulted performers, that is one of my big lines. And as well, similar, I've heard stories of producers who have been similar with being the ones who have been abusive or coercive. Again, you are the one who knows your experiences. Sometimes we don't know experiences and we need another voice to listen, to give their perspective or share their thoughts if they have similar experiences either with that producer or just in their lives. And sometimes we don't have the language around it, but you're still the one who experienced it and who remembers what happened. I just really want to emphasize that your safety, whether you're a performer or a producer or an industry professional in any type of way, your safety matters, your voice matters, your art matters, and your needs matter. And if anybody makes you feel differently, like they don't, I really hope you find the people who do. Not just feel, but know that you matter. Yeah, so that's the end of my little ramble here. Editing Cherry out, and I will go back to Fancy Burlesque Cherry. And as a performer, you might be wondering, there's a lot of red flags. This is kind of scary. Why do I even want to try? Please know there are benefits. There are so many producers that are worth your while and so many spaces that are fantastic to work in. And if you want to see some of those green flags, again, I really recommend you check out my green flag video because I do go over quite a few different options and things that I've seen in practice that hopefully will help you feel encouraged and feeling more confident in navigating. You might be wondering, between those two, the green flags, yellow flags, and red flags, how do I talk to producers? Please ask questions upon hire. As a performer, you have every right to ask questions of a producer upon hire, and even up until the show day. If you want clarity on something, if you're going to be late on sending show notes because of a situation that came up for you, if a producer ever makes you feel like you don't have that right, then I really recommend you go where you do feel valued. However, if you do want to know how to ask questions, what is the pay scale and how are you going to get paid and when? What practices does the producer include to ensure intersectionally diverse casts and accessibility? And look for specific answers of what that looks like rather than just, yes, we work towards accessibility. What does the producer need from performers and when? What can you expect from the producer for communications, timelines, etc.? And also what kind of communications do they expect back in return? That way you can all be on the same page, and because again, everyone's communication style looks different, you can know what to expect. And there are some other questions as well that I did talk about in my what to expect when hired video. Check that one out if you want to know a bunch of different questions you can ask, but those are probably my top 4 that I ask most of the time. At any point, whether you're being hired, whether it's during your process of getting ready for a show, at the show, if at any point you're feeling unsure or questioning, or maybe you're even like, is this a me thing? Am I missing something? Don't be afraid to be transparent and honest with the producer. Having conversations, letting people know where you're at, how you're feeling is actually healthy. I also believe that conflict is healthy as long as we know how to navigate it, and as long as we're willing to come into it with the goal of solving the conflict or the goal of sharing what needs to be shared so somebody can learn. And as performers, we don't always get our way. Sometimes it is us. Sometimes I've sent in my show notes late, and that was my fault. Sometimes my communication style does not line up with other people's communication style. We're not always entitled to stage time either. At any point, if you ever feel unsure about something, please be transparent. Don't be afraid to speak up or share your perspective. I've mentioned this already, but if this is your first time working with a specific producer, ask around. Ask other performers what their experience was like. Ask other producers if they've worked with them. Get a little bit more of a well-rounded, informed approach of how to work with this human if you are unsure. And not necessarily for performers to ask, but as a producer, know your capacity. I know a lot of producers who get really excited, who take on a lot of work, who don't just produce, but they perform. They might do community work, they might do consultations, they might teach. It's really easy to add to your workload, but as soon as you start to feel tired, drained, if you find you're taking on more than you can manage, then it can risk starting to affect your performers. Even if you're a producer who's normally on top of things, who normally is very well intentioned, but if you're getting tired and burnt out, then sometimes it does involve having an honest conversation with yourself of, can I continue producing this year? Or do I need to take a break? Do I need to stop teaching? Do I need to do something? Where is my heart pulling me so that I can put it where it needs to without being negatively impacted? And for performers, I mentioned this already, but please go where you feel authentically valued. There are a lot of different ways that people show value. There's a lot of different ways that people show appreciation. And sometimes that aligns with what you like to feel, and sometimes it doesn't. Not every space is for everybody. Only you, again, can decide what works for you. What are your green flags? What are the red flags? What are some things that you're willing to accept? And what are some things that you're like, nope, this is not for me, and walk away. At the end of the year, I think about the shows I've been in, which ones have I appreciated, which ones did I not really, I could have done without. I try to use that energy to help me plan for future performances or the next year of what am I willing to accept this year or not. Making sure you have that active engagement with yourself of, what does burlesque look like to you and what do you want it to? That's some of my red flags. Check out my other video for my green flags, but I'm curious, what are some of your red flags or yellow flags? What questions do you like to ask producers? Leave it all down below. I would love to see what people consider red flags and how you navigate those. But thank you for watching today's video. Hit that subscribe button. I am Cherry Cheeks and this is Cheeky Burlesque. I will see you next time. Bye!